Hi, everybody. My name is Pastor Ryan Radke, and this is the midweek message from Messiah Lutheran Church in Mechanicsville, Virginia. We're going to continue on the series I've been doing, talking about Christian nationalism. This started out of a couple of things. First of all, there's been some public figures, some elected officials saying that, yes, I am a Christian nationalist. That's a good thing. I'm proud to be that. And just that term and that kind of line of thought being around a lot. And then in response to some of those things, our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, uh, put out a thing saying, hey, remember a few years ago, on behalf of the denomination, I signed on to this statement called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, because Christian nationalism is not a good thing um, in the long run and historically speaking. So, based on that, and I've got some things to share from the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website. And then a book that I had on my shelf that I'd been meaning to read but hadn't gotten to yet. It seemed to go together. It's called Betrayal, German Churches and the Holocaust, edited by Robert P. Erickson and Susanna Heschel. Now, this is from 1999, and they were talking about sort of the Christian nationalism, not necessarily using that term, but it is boils down to the same thing, among some of the churches in Germany, both Protestant and Catholic, in the build up to and during World War II and the Holocaust. And so I wanted to use this book as even just a conversation partner. I'm not really doing a study on this book, but I wanted to use it as sort of a springboard in terms of talking about Christian nationalism coming back up again. Thought it'd be good to do a little bit of a recap from the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website on what they're talking about, what we've been talking about. So first off, how do you define Christian nationalism? These are all from the FAQ, the Frequently Asked Questions tab on their website. There are various definitions and understandings of Christian nationalism. The statement, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, defines it as a political ideology that seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. So it chokes off separation of church and state. It chokes off the fullness of scripture and Christian tradition and just kind of picks and chooses the things that kind of mutually benefit each other so that neither is any more recognizable. And both kind of are used to support the goals of the other. The next one was, is the United States a Christian nation? A lot of folks say that. This question could be referring to many things, this website says. The Constitution is clear that the country wasn't founded for Christians or to prefer Christians. I've mentioned this before. Think of the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock. They were trying to get out of England because they didn't want to do things the way the Church of England did. Europe had a lot of state churches, including Germany, all the way up to World War II. There are still state churches there now, although they don't function quite the same way. So the U.S. Constitution created a system of government open to people of any faith. Article 6 prohibits any religious test for public office. Sometimes when people say the United States is a Christian nation, they are referring to demographics. Most surveys find around 70% of the American population identify with Christianity. Whether they're going to church or not, that's how they identify. So it can be accurate to say that we are a majority Christian nation. The numbers decrease when surveys go deeper to ask questions about frequency of engaging in Christian practices, such as prayer, Bible study, or attending corporate worship services. In that respect, not so much. And in terms of the drafting of our Constitution and things like that, no, that we're not set up to be a state church kind of system. So in that respect, no, we're not a Christian nation, not like the Roman Empire. Can Christianity influence public policy? The statement affirms people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Separating the institutions of religion and government does not and should not silence religious voices in the public square. People approach voting and public policy from a variety of perspectives, including their religious beliefs and ethics. Often there are religious viewpoints on multiple sides of a policy debate. Okay, so I remember having one of our professors in seminary tell the story about when he was a parish pastor going to a public forum about the possibility of I forget now, I think it was a racetrack, like a horse or dog track, some type of gambling related enterprise being built. And he ended up speaking against it. And in that context, he said showing up in a collar and everything maybe would have made folks take what he was saying in a different way. Oh, you're just saying that as a pastor. So he came as just a citizen and spoke against it. But also, his faith was one of the reasons why he thought it would be a bad idea for that community in that context in that time. And so his faith influenced his politics, but it didn't have to be this, you know, necessarily overt thing. Sometimes it is. I've seen protests in recent years with clergy in collars, in full garb, there at the protest as a visible symbol to say, yes, as a representative of the Church of Christ, I'm against this. But it's a contextual thing. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean that you wrap the two up in an inextricable knot. I think the next question on their site is helpful too. How is nationalism different from patriotism? Because I think some folks hear that and as synonymous. Patriotism is love of country that is expressed in many ways, such as waving an American flag, volunteering at a food bank, teaching in the public schools, serving in the military, running for public office, or protesting policies with which you agree. All of these are great expressions of patriotism. Nationalism is an extreme form of patriotism that demands a position of superiority and has little or no room for dissent or disagreement. Okay? So it's one thing to love your country, it's another thing to say, my country is better than everybody else and we're never wrong. And then it says, can you give some examples of Christian nationalism? Examples of Christian nationalism can range from derogatory and exclusionary comments to issues of life and death. Christian nationalists often use the idea of Christianity or Christian language to demand conformity and promote policies and behaviors that solidify their power or status against others, which is not a very Christ-like move. The whole humbling himself to the point of death thing. Christian nation mythology is often used to marginalize non-Christians in political activity. Some of the white nationalists, who also were Christians, who marched through Charlottesville wore cross necklaces while chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Christian nationalism in the hands of extremists can lead to acts of violence, such as the shootings at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and the Chabad of Poway Synagogue near San Diego, California. At times, these violent acts are perpetuated by those who mix Christian theology with nationalist ideas of exclusion and superiority. So, if you're using your Christianity in a political way as a cudgel against others who don't think like you or believe like you, that's bad. This week I've got two chapters from the book that went together because up till now we've been talking about the Protestant, mostly Lutheran Church in Germany. These two chapters got into the German Catholic side of things, the other major denomination in Germany at the time. Not a minority group, something like, I think it said something like 40% of Germany's population at that time was, somehow related to, involved in, identified as Catholics. So we're going to talk about that again, kind of like last week talking about Bonhoeffer. I mean, there are some good examples here of Christian nationalism. I'm going to bring those up, but this is a not a book about that, but it does parallel a lot of what we're talking about. So, in the midst of this deep dive into the German Catholic side of things and their role or their voice or lack of voice in the build up to the Holocaust and Nazi policies. It goes into other areas, but we'll lift up the things that relate to what we're talking about. And I know I keep saying don't be selectively interpretive. Just trying to find the parallels. I encourage everybody to read this book, see what they think of it. You can borrow my copy or order one online. Okay, so don't hear me as like picking and choosing in that respect. I'm just trying to find the intersecting areas. Page 135, in case you're following along at home. Here we go. So much like some of the confessing church on the Lutheran side, that didn't necessarily, at the beginning especially, speak out against the treatment of Jews as a whole, because we've already talked about there was this underlying anti-Semitism in both just German society and backed up by and lifted up by German theology. So the main push was to say, hey, don't do this to the German Christians. Don't do this to the the Jewish Christians, the the Jewish folks or folks of Jewish ancestry that converted to or had become Christians. And so in that vein, a lot of what the Catholic Church in this discussion was about was protecting the uh, Catholics of Jewish descent or Catholic or Jews who had converted to Catholicism or had married a Catholic and become Catholic that way. Okay. So it says, but what of non-Arians who were not members of the Catholic faith? During the years prior to the adoption of the final solution, a few instances are on record where individual churchmen did speak up in defense of the Jews. Overall, not so much, but in March 1933, a priest in the Rhineland, in a sermon, characterized the vilification of the Jews as unjust and was fined 500 marks for abuse of the pulpit. So there's an example of unhealthy relationship between church and state. You could actually get fined for abuse of the pulpit. Now, if a church gets overly partisan and starts pushing one party over another in sermons publicly, that can maybe become an issue. If you start actively promoting one candidate in a race, then that might affect your nonprofit status. So that is enforcing the separation of church and state in our system. But in this system, this priest got fined for abuse of the pulpit. Okay, where did I leave off? In 1934, another priest who, for reasons of safety, chose to remain anonymous, took his church to task for not helping the Jews. And yet another priest in Bavaria in 1936 declared that the stories being told in Germany about the Jews were a pack of lies. In Berlin, on the morning after the Kristallnacht pogrom of November 1938, Provost Bernhard Lichtenberg prayed for the persecuted non-Aryan Christians and Jews and added, "What took place yesterday we know, what will be tomorrow we do not know. But what happened today, that we have witnessed. Outside this church the synagogue is burning, and that also is a house of God." And there are probably other such statements, and here and there acts of Samaritanism may have taken place that have remained unrecorded, but the church as such, speaking through the voice of its bishops, extended neither aid nor sympathy to other than Catholic non-Arians, and remained silent in the face of anti-Jewish legislation, burning temples, and the first roundups of Jews. So again, very much parallel to the confessing church on the Protestant side. And as we'll see, there were certain theologians and bishops and others who were just fine with things. Maybe not quite to the enthusiasm of the German Christian side of the Protestants, um, but still kind of went along with things, supported things. So there were some opponents, but there were consequences. As I mentioned, the other side of this conversation, the opposite end of Christian nationalism, where you combine it so much that you lose the essence of either, would be when the church needs to step out to speak against a government or a practice, a law that is prayerfully agreed upon by everybody to be contrary to the gospel. So there were some who stepped out in that vein. Other examples in these chapters also talked about how the Catholic Church petitioned the Gestapo that when Jews were made to wear the yellow stars, that they wouldn't have to wear them in church. Like if they came to a Catholic service, don't make them wear the yellow stars, because they didn't want to have to make anybody uncomfortable. I think they were maybe more worried about the non-star wearing people, but like everybody be the same. There were some theological pushback to say, in the church, there's no separation. Very Pauline, no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, right? All are one in Christ. So there was some theological pushback, but mostly in terms of how it would play out in services. We didn't want to segregate or separate or identify. The Gestapo didn't go with that. They still got to wear their stars. Another big deal was that in the Catholic Church, Lutherans have two sacraments, communion and baptism. Catholics and others count 7. One of those is marriage. And so for the Catholic Church, they said, listen, you can't go shipping off Jews or people of Jewish descent who converted to Catholicism if they're married to a full Catholic, because that's a sacrament. We can't break up that sacrament. We can't not allow them to get married because that's a sacrament. And so there was some pushback on that too, but that there was, even if it was in terms of, um, even if it was in terms of, sorry, got distracted for a second, um, being advocates for these people, it was because it was pushing up against the church traditions and the church laws. So, those are two examples of other kinds of pushback, but they were couched in "don't mess with our traditions." It may have had the benefit, or at least it worked as the vehicle to actually protect people. And a lot of Catholic churches helped export, or sorry, not export, get Jews across the borders to safer places, occasionally hide them in churches and convents and things like that, but more so in other countries. Also remember that Italy was allies with Germany during World War II. And Italy is where Rome is, and Rome is where the Vatican is. The Vatican is its own independent city-state, but it's still within this territory. And so the Pope, two different popes during this time, one of the chapters focuses on Pope Pius XII, was very much trying to stay neutral through all of this. If you looked at bishops, though, in Dutch, Belgian, and French Catholic territories, they were much more outspoken, pushed back much more, had much more recriminations from the Nazi regimes that had moved into those areas, but hit a lot more Jews and had a lot more pushback. In Germany, not as much. The Pope in general tried to stay neutral, and there's some theories on that on page 146. Since the end of World War II, Pius XII has often been criticized for his silence. It has been argued, and most recently by a playwright named Hawkhuth, who wrote a play about all of this, that the Pope could have saved numerous lives if indeed he could not have halted the machinery of destruction altogether, had he chosen to take a public stand, and had he confronted the Germans with the threat of an interdict or with excommunication of Hitler, Goebbels, and other leading Nazis belonging to the Catholic faith. As examples of the effectiveness of public protests, it is possible to cite the resolute reaction of the German episcopate, the diocese, I guess, to the euthanasia programs that were also going on to eliminate folks that were deemed to have too many physical or mental handicaps to be allowed to have their genes passed on. Also, in Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, forceful intervention of papal nuncios who threatened the Quisling governments with public condemnation by the Pope was able, albeit temporarily, to stop the deportations. At the very least, it has been suggested a public denunciation of the mass murders by Pius XII, broadcast widely over the Vatican radio, would have revealed to Jews and Christians alike what deportation to the East actually meant. The Pope would have been believed, whereas the broadcasts of the Allies were often shrugged off as war propaganda. Many of the deportees who accepted the assurances of the Germans that they were merely being resettled might thus have been warned and given an impetus to escape. Many more Christians might have helped and sheltered Jews, and many more lives might have then been saved. And then one other. There exists, of course, no way of definitively proving or disproving these arguments. Whether a papal decree of excommunication against Hitler would have dissuaded the Fuhrer from carrying out his plan to destroy the Jews is very doubtful, and revocation of the Concordat, the agreement, by the Holy See would have bothered Hitler still less. However, a flaming protest against the massacre of the Jews, coupled with an imposition of the interdict upon all of Germany, or the excommunication of all Catholics in any way involved with the apparatus of the final solution, would have been a more formidable and effective weapon. Yet, this was precisely the kind of action which the Pope could not take without risking the allegiance of the German Catholics. given the indifference of the German population toward the fate of the Jews and the highly ambivalent attitude of the German hierarchy toward Nazi anti-Semitism. A forceful stand by the Supreme Pontiff on the Jewish question might well have led to a large-scale desertion from the church. A correspondent for a Catholic newspaper in Berlin asked Pius XII whether he would not protest the extermination of the Jews. The Pope is reported to have answered, "Dear friend, do not forget that millions of Catholics serve in the German armies. Shall I bring them into conflicts of conscience?" The Pope knew that German Catholics were not prepared to suffer martyrdom for their church. Still less were they willing to incur the wrath of their Nazi rulers for the sake of the Jews, whom their own bishops for years had castigated as harmful influence in German life, just like the Lutheran side. In the final analysis, then, the Vatican's silence only reflected the deep feeling of the Catholic masses of Europe. So, yeah, here we go again with the quietism, the inaction side of things. And so that brings us to a question of culture. So in terms of culture, so I had to pause the recording for a second, take a phone call, but we're back. In terms of culture, whoops. As I've said in previous sessions of this, and even just a minute ago, there was a whole cultural thing that had been built up of anti-Semitism in Germany. And so when you look at the Catholic Church in other countries, there was a lot more pushback. When you look at the bishops in those other countries, there was a lot more pushback. But when you look at Germany, the culture was very different. And there's a whole slew of things that led to that we've talked about before. The theological tradition, and Germany was like one of the main theological, factories of the 19th century. German theologians were like, wow, like they're doing the work. They were pushing the envelope, right? And included in that was picking up the tradition and solidifying it that the Jews were bad. They killed Christ. They're wandering the earth now and can't find a home because it's a punishment from God. All of this, schlock that had nothing to do with the fact that Jesus was Jewish. In fact, as we get into World War II, they did mental gymnastics and theological gymnastics and contortions to say, oh, Jesus wasn't really Jewish, and just like, filter things out to fit the national ideology there. And so all of that was there, and plus then there was this period after the Kaiser went down called the Weimar Republic, and they tried parliamentarism, and there were these more, liberal ideas, not liberal in the sense that we would talk about it, conservative liberal, but just that more like a liberal arts college, like this sort of individualism, equalitarianism, things like that. And so there was a big pushback against that too, because it was seen as leaving behind tradition and accountability and law and order, and people didn't like it. They wanted the top-down thing. Some people did. And so when the Weimar Republic dissolved with the National Socialist Party on the rise and Hitler taking power, there was this conflation of the church and the state to say, yes, the Nazi Party also wants to get back in law and order, and the more conservative wings of the churches were like, yes, that'll help us, and we'll support them, and they'll support us, and it will get back to the way things were and traditional values and all that stuff. And so there was this whole, and then tied up in that was this idea of the German folk, right? That the German people were going to do their thing, and these other peoples did their things, but the German folk were specially blessed by God and needing to be, lifted up and purified and all of that stuff. And so that is something I think we can learn from this period of time, because there are folks out there that talk about American exceptionalism, right? I do think America is exceptional, and I think we're exceptional because of things like separation of church and state, freedom of speech, freedom to worship how you want, freedom to protest, where a lot of countries don't allow you that right. That everybody has a say in things, and on paper, in theory at least, right? And so, but if it gets to the point where American exceptionalism, Christian nationalism, rears their ugly head, and it becomes America's never wrong, America's never done anything wrong in the past, we don't learn from our history, we don't admit from and learn from our mistakes, And if we somehow get to this point of saying, no, American people are special, the American country is special, we are specially blessed by God, America is God's country, then that's leading down a dangerous path. Yes, we can sing God Bless America, but not to the point of saying God bless America, but curse the other countries. God bless America, but only the Americans who think and act like me, whatever your thinking and acting like me means. That's not good. And it's not good if it gets to the point of God has blessed America and only in this particular sense, and therefore we need to use and meld our religion and our one way of seeing things and our politics and our one way of seeing things to the um, detriment of, punishment of anybody who doesn't think the same. Again, there's a difference between a government or a policy that is so contrary to the gospel that it needs to be resisted, called out, and held accountable, and just, oh, they think differently than maybe that makes me uncomfortable. Maybe they're a different religion, maybe they're a different politics. And so being uncomfortable with a different point of view is not the same as something that's contrary to the gospel. If you think that something is contrary to the gospel, then we have a conversation about that. We have lots of different people talk about it, pray about it, examine scriptures, turn to all the things God has given us, faith, tradition, our reasoning, scriptures, all of this stuff to come to some decision about, is this contrary to the gospel? Should this be resisted? All of these things. Should we use our faith in a political way? But that's different than saying our faith and politics are one. I hope the distinction is there. Maybe I'm beating a dead horse. Maybe I'm splitting hairs. But that's the thing. We need to be very careful to examine our culture and how it's playing out and what parts of our culture might be leading down this path that we have seen before. And so, yeah, we need to be grounded in Scripture, guided by the Holy Spirit, experience, reason, tradition, all that stuff. We have to be careful also not to the second chapter on the Catholic side of things is about this theologian named Lortz, Joseph Lortz, who had this whole thing about the history of ideas, and so he did the same thing that the others did on the other chapters, used theology to justify Nazism and all this stuff. And so, but instead of revising scripture and removing Jewishness from scripture or Jewishness from worship texts or just taking this ridiculous contortionist approach to things, he was very much revising theology and again only picking and choosing and interpreting things in a way. And again, as I've said this before, just wrestle with things. And if something seems a little off, something seems like, well, if you think to yourself, well, wait, what about this other thing? You're like, oh no, don't forget that other thing. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. Then there's probably something amiss. So that's where you prayerfully, faithfully, scripturally say, let's talk about this. I don't think this is right. You also have to look at the heritage and the history of a country, of a society. In Germany, the big thing was anti-Semitism. In our country, there's things like racism, the lasting, still present effects of slavery and other policies and things that still have not been fully addressed. That is our sin that we need to deal with as a country. That's one thing. How indigenous folks were treated, killed off, treaties not honored, forced off of lands. That's another thing. We've got stuff too. We've got baked in stuff in our country. We have to be honest about it, learn from it, repent from things, change things. Some folks tried to do that in Germany at this time, but they were overwhelmed by so many other competing things and folks that supported this. There's a tendency among Christian nationalists thinking too of more of a top-down dictatorial approach. Get these people in line. part of the pushback in these chapters that they lifted up again um, was looking at, things like parliamentarianism. Parliamentarianism was bad because it focused too much on the individual, and it needed to be more top down, needed to be more authoritarian. Again, yes, we say Christ is the head of the body, but then we also say the body has many members, and all the members of the body have gifts and need to be equally respected and part of the body. So the Christian teaching on things is Christ is our head, but how we operate as a church is very equalitarian. Everybody's got a place at the table. Everybody's gifted by the Spirit in baptism. Everybody is created in the image of God and called good. And so you don't euthanize the people who are different from you, mentally, physically. You don't scapegoat an entire race or religion, because every single individual on this planet is created in the image of God. That would be the competing ideology and theology that I would lift up. So if you get church folks or politicians or Christian nationalists talking about scapegoating one group or distrustful of everybody having a voice, that's not a real Christian thing either. What else do we got this week? Be careful of revisionists. I guess that's a big thing. That's a carrying theme through all of this. Another excerpt from pages 149 to 150. And this page too. This is talking about the Vicar General of the Diocese of Mainz, a Monsignor. This is a region in Germany. Apologies to our German listeners, our German viewers. I don't know my German geography very well. But this man named Meyer, he was against the Nazi program's understanding of religion in its infamous Article 24. He criticized specifically the Nazi notion of positive Christianity, the Nazi Party's conceptual umbrella for understanding not only Christianity, but also, in fact, all religion as being necessarily in accord with both state policy and accepted social rules and cultural norms. That would be state-enforced Christian nationalism. The churches better toe the line. They better support whatever we do. Be positive. For Mayer, true Catholic moral and theological beliefs transcended particular times and historical movements, and therefore it would be a great error to demand that the Christian church be made to conform with the ethical and moral sense of the Germanic race. He went on to attack the concept of a German God, German Christianity. That's why it's interesting still for me to see weird mixtures of patriotism and Christianity on bumper stickers and things like that. A star-spangled cross. No. So this Monsignor rejected the concept of a German God, a German Christianity, which was very, very prevalent at the time. Any understanding of a national church that was somehow distinctive in its Germanic character. National Socialism and Catholicism were wholly incompatible, and hence there was no way a person could be both a Nazi and a Catholic, he said. This was in 1930, okay? So knocking things down. 3 years later, on 10th of November 1933, the same Vicar General of Mainz, Monsignor Meyer, wrote to the same Nazi district office offering a church burial for a Nazi district chief who had died in 1931, who had been denied a Catholic funeral. At this point, 3 years later, Meyer offered not only to bless the grave, but also to hold a special funeral mass in which representatives of the district of the Nazi Party in Nazi uniform would have a special place of honor. In a very short time, Meyer had completely reversed his previous decision. There was an enormous amount of pressure. It doesn't excuse it, but it was there. And folks that pushed against it found themselves confronted on both the religious side and the national side. Not to. That's the other danger of Christian nationalism. is it chokes out that struggle, that striving, that wrestling with tough issues and demands compliance, positive Christianity, or quietism, or it drives you out of the country, or as this went down, pushed you into a concentration camp, um, or in jail, or something, or fined for abusing the pulpit, things like that. And so I do worry about this idea that America is especially blessed in God's eyes, um, because I think it can lead down a tricky path. Um, you know, a lot of congregations have big discussions and arguments over whether or not there should be flags in their sanctuary or at all. So our first allegiance is to Christ, not to country, as a Christian. And there are some folks who don't want the flags in the sanctuary at all. If I'm remembering my history, my church history, right, there was a big pushback in our country as well during World War I and World War II, especially among German Lutheran congregations in our country, not to conduct their services in German anymore. Most of the Lutheran congregations in America really, they were like the second or third or fourth wave of immigrants, so they really held on to the traditions of the mother and fatherland stronger than other immigrants who had already kind of acclimated and kind of been absorbed into the melting pot more so. And so there was a lot more German services and Norwegian and Swedish and Danish and German. Um, and so a lot of German Lutheran congregations in this country ditched the German, did their services in English, and even put flags on to say, look, we're patriotic, we're Americans, we're not Germans. And so, why are those there? Not saying we need to get rid of them, but we need to know why they're there. We need to know the history, and we need to understand what they mean and what they don't. What it could look like to somebody who hasn't been a part of a congregation before, who hasn't been brought up, just used to seeing them there. Do we know that our first allegiance is to Christ and not country? That's what we signed up for. That's what whatever country you were born in, whatever time period, you're Christian first and that nationality second or farther. So it is something to be aware of. If you start saying that we should have it's one thing to say a prayer for, in the context of our country, I'll say a prayer for Veterans Day, I'll say a prayer for Memorial Day, Labor Day, these different 4th of July national holidays. But that doesn't mean that we need a Star-Spangled Cross. Again, I don't know if I'm beating dead horses or splitting hairs, but I hope what I'm trying to get across is coming across. Doesn't mean I'm not patriotic. I love our country. At the same time, I'm Christian first. And I want to make sure that everybody's clear on the order of things, priority of things. And then also, kind of going along with this, talking about how it went from resistance to capitulation among some Catholics in Germany, like this mayor gentleman. German Catholicism was under pressure to exhibit and encourage nationalism. The long legacy of the cultural struggle is an essential background piece. Beginning in 1871, Otto von Bismarck and the Prussian Protestant elite implemented a series of efforts intended to suppress the influence of Catholics and reduce their public vote. Although this anti-Catholic policy gradually diminished until it was eventually overturned in the 1880s, in an agreement with Pope Leo XIII, it left behind deep social wounds. Catholics emerged from this struggle with the self-perception of an embattled minority under wholly unjustified suspicion. In an effort to disprove the charge that German Catholics were somehow less than true Germans, they tended to develop an urgent patriotism, like stopping your services in German and putting flags in your congregation. As is often later, in the supercharged atmosphere of post-World War I Germany, a time of extraordinary national sensitivity based on a widespread feeling of victimization and international abuse, German Catholics were eager to demonstrate an appropriately zealous degree of patriotic fervor. As is often true of minorities out to confirm a common cause with the majority, there was a tendency to overdo it. In the Germany of the 1920s, German Catholics had just such a tendency towards hyper-nationalism. The more the Nazis became the chief proponents of German nationalism, especially after National Socialism took over the German state, the more difficult it became for Catholics to resist giving their approval. So there's such a thing as like peer pressure, denominational peer pressure. I know I've been told by other Christians I've met that I'm not a real Christian if I didn't think like them, believe like them, if I wasn't baptized like them. And so there, under extreme circumstances like this, there can be a sense of this sort of need to prove yourself, to fit in, to not be persecuted. And part of our culture today is that everybody feels anxious and afraid and aggrieved all the time because that sells commercials, that sells advertising. Make people feel afraid and then make them listen to you because you'll make them feel better. So there's a whole market out there of making people feel afraid and aggrieved. And so then it makes sense that there's those out there who say, well, I got to show my patriotism and I need to show the depth of the conviction of my faith here. And I'm going to put those two things together. Close this out. A couple more excerpts and we'll finish up. This I talked about already. This idea of the parliamentarianism and the degeneration of society, loose contemporary norms of social behavior. This Joseph Lortz talked about. He said, National Socialism is an outspoken opponent of godlessness and public immorality as it has dominated modern civilization and the increasingly effective liberal permissiveness in turning society toward an unchristian life. We Catholics have protested tirelessly in countless press campaigns, pamphlets, sermons, conference resolutions, and parliamentary proposals against trash and filth. But this effort remained mainly in the theoretical realm because we were not the state. But now, because of National Socialism, the power exists to be independently effective, and in its attack upon the cesspool of the capital of Berlin, we already see the result. So I want to contrast that approach to saying, hey, the state thinks like we do now. Let's back the state, and they'll back us. There's a little difference between that and what I've talked about before, and that I've called like the Lutheran lobby or Lutheran Office of Public Policy. Faithful Lutherans, lay folks, clergy, going to their elected officials and saying, due to based on our faith and our understanding of Scripture and God's love, we lobby you, encourage you, based on our constituency of all these Lutherans out there, to vote this way on matters of things like hunger and poverty and things like that, conservation, things like that, looking for the generations ahead. So, so there's a difference in method there between this and kind of what our Lutheran lobbyists do, or what I'm encouraging folks to do, to use their faith to influence their civic duty. So the method there is different between this guy saying, "Hey, they like what we like, so let's back them," and just voting your conscience. There's a difference in method there. Also, there's a difference in terms of the subject matter, because are we resisting the Holocaust? That's a matter that's central to the gospel, protecting those children of God that are being persecuted and having genocide brought against them. That's a little different too than just saying, well, there's loose morals. That's kind of the job of the churches then, isn't it? To have their members be preached to and taught and encouraged to change the world through love and to love the sinners around them and show a different way, not in a judgmental way, like, oh, I'm better than you, look down your nose at them. But that isn't that the place of congregational teaching? Not to have necessarily what the congregation wants to be taught enforced with Gestapo by the government. Again, do you see the difference? Okay. Where is the realm in terms of moral stuff? I feel like that's the realm of the church to teach that. Are there laws that should have a sort of a base level of morality in our country? Yeah. But yeah. And lastly, last excerpt. Lawrence's emphasis on the kinship between Catholic and Nazi ideals recalls a common concept in practical politics, namely the old conviction that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so there's all this stuff too about pushing back against Bolshevism and communism, pushing back against this social democratic liberalism, Marxism, and all this stuff. All the things that they thought were wrong and bad for society. Well, the Nazis were against those things too. So as a church, let's support the Nazis. So also just be careful of that sort of enemy of my enemy is my friend thing, because if you conflate church and state, that's not the same thing as forming. I'm just repeating myself. I don't need to say this all again. Um, there are parallels of these sentiments today. Here's a list of things and groups and ideas that are wrong in our country right now, that are eroding the morals and the societal fabric of our country. Whatever your list is and whatever you agree with, how you address that, your method, um, needs to be careful. If it's completely contrary to the gospel, then resist and push back. If it's just something you don't agree with or don't like, then you don't need to use the state as a cudgel to get what you want, because it's your way of thinking. Um, I feel like I've just repeated myself a lot. Maybe that's where I should stop then. Just remember the subject matter. Are we talking Holocaust or are we talking um, loose morals? Are we talking folks don't love their neighbors as much anymore? Then let's change that through our witness and our faith and our evangelism, our social ministry, our social justice work. We don't need to turn the state into a police state to get that done. Um, and if we do want to make changes, we do them through different channels, not by just combining the two in an unhealthy way. Anyway, I've been saying this for a few weeks now. I hope you get the point. That was these two chapters. I got one more of these left, one chapter to go, and that one is called Post-Holocaust Theology, German Theological Responses Since 1945. So I will record that one for you all next week and put that out there. And then just some marketing. This coming Sunday, September 11th, is Rally Day. It is our sort of fall programming kickoff Sunday. We're going to have a very fun activity, getting folks into the Bible, getting our kids and all ages, really, just a little tour of the Bible with a fun activity that starts at 9:15. And then we'll get the kids to their classrooms. And for the adults, you can sit down with me and find out what our first adult study will be of the fall, starting on September 18th. I guess it'll be advertised a little bit. It's called Teaching Christ to Christians, the Book of Colossians. So, uh, Colossae was a city that had a lot of different religions and cultures in it. And so, this letter to the Colossians is trying to remind them how this all works. Helpful, I think, to us today who live in a pretty pluralistic world right now, lots of different religions and viewpoints. That's very threatening to some, might lead them down the path of Christian nationalism. But we can just reaffirm who Christ is and get out there and share it. So that's what I'm going to talk about for um, the adults on Sunday, and then starting the 18th, we'll have those conversations, just walking through that book of the Bible and the New Testament together, and I'll try to record those sessions for those of you at home as well. But that's what's on the horizon, and so I got one more of these, and then we'll move back to in-person classes that we will record. Thank you for watching these. I hope my ramblings and my repetitions are getting something across. But I do this, and our denomination has signed on to this because there is a real danger that we can learn from in history about what Christian nationalism can lead towards. And so I want everybody aware of it. I want everybody to have some tools in terms of how to talk about it and what it is and what it isn't. And hopefully we can move forward through this and not go down this road. And recognize it when we see it. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.